You're not just trying to engage people, you're trying to get people to engage with you. And so I think the most powerful thing there is that you're not making an assumption that just because this is an 8-year-old child or a 65-year-old grown-up or adult, that they are coming to the table with a specific slate of knowledge or expectations or experiences. You're rather saying, I'd like to give you a voice to tell me where you're coming from and what you think about whatever we're trying to teach you or help you with or support you by providing. And then in understanding that person's voice, creating a more just and equitable approach to educating or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish.
Hi, everyone. This is David Paull, and on this episode, I'm talking with Dr. Lindsay Portnoy. Dr. Portnoy is Chief Learning Officer at a company called Killer Snails that creates games that inspire a love of science for kids. She's also a cognitive scientist with nearly 2 decades of experience studying human development, teaching, and learning from birth through adolescence. A former public school teacher and university professor, Dr. Portnoy's research on the science of learning and engagement drives her work to create immersive learning experiences. She's presented at national conferences for the Association of Psychological Science, the American Educational Research Association, the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, and much more. She's also published in both academic journals, such as the Journal of Educational Research and Assessment, and with widely read industry media outlets, including EdSurge and Getting Smart. In this conversation, we talk about how an advertisement on the train changed the course of her life, how the notion of engagement isn't universal and different people engage in different ways, how games and gamification can be used to create more effective learning environments, and much more. There's a lot to be learned from Dr. Portnoy's diverse background and wide range of experience, so check it out. Hi, Dr. Portnoy. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
For those who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, let's see. I grew up in the Midwest and went to school initially for marketing and advertising, which is what brought me to New York City to work in advertising for a couple of years. And I loved it. It was really great work. And I was really fascinated always with the brand strategy side of things. In fact, I didn't know that that existed until I was working at a firm. And I remember being fascinated by this. I worked in the media side, and so we were looking at the demographics and the psychographics of the population. And it was always really interesting to me sort of how these brand strategists took the information that they had and helped to define their target market. And anyway, to make a long story short, September 11th happened when I was living in the city, and it was very impactful for me and many of those around me. And I remember one day being on the subway and seeing an advertisement, something to the effect of, will your spreadsheets remember you in 20 years? And I was deeply moved and thought, well, I'm not sure that they will. And it was an advertisement for the New York City Teaching Fellows. And through that advertisement, I ended up applying and subsequently being accepted into the Teaching Fellows program, which was an incredible opportunity for me to learn about education and to sort of master the craft of being an educator and working in the classroom and working alongside some really incredible educators and voices in our field. Through that work, I started engaging with my professors in the program, and they sort of all were like, Lindsay, you ask a lot of questions. I maybe feel like you might want to go into academia, or you might want to pursue more of an education. And so I taught for a couple of years and then ended up going back to school to get a PhD in educational psychology, studying with Dr. Mitchell Rabinowitz in cognitive psych. And in that program, understanding developmental and cognitive psychology really helped me as I worked on faculty at Hunter College, working with teachers and helping them sort of see the psychology of the learners in their classroom. And it was a really interesting synthesis of where I had started in the land of advertising and my fascination with media and brand strategy, with how to meet people where they are and how to create messages that are impactful and hopefully, as we'll talk about later, engaging. And more importantly, and what we try to do is justice driven, where we're raising voices and providing experiences for individuals to have sort of meaningful interaction with complex content that gives them a sense of satisfaction and efficacy. So I had done that work for many years at Hunter College, was really lucky to work with thousands of educators across the state. Through that work, I met some incredible researchers, including Dr. Holford, who does research in science. And together, Dr. Holford, myself, and Jessica Ochoa Hendricks, who is our CEO now, we were invited to apply for a National Science Foundation grant to bring Dr. Holford's research on these venomous marine snails out of the laboratory and into the hands of learners, and get kids excited about learning science and see themselves as scientists by creating these playful gaming experiences, which is what we're doing right now with Killer Snails. So currently, as I'm speaking to you, I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Killer Snails, which is a company, a immersive experience design company. We make games to increase kids' love of learning science. I also am very lucky to be teaching through Northeastern University's College of Professional Studies, their Graduate School of Education. Recently wrote a book that will be published this October. I'm very excited about that as well. And I feel like we have a lot of things to talk about.
We do. That's an incredible background. And I was struck by the irony of the fact that you started in marketing and advertising, but then your career took a pretty serious left turn, and it was an ad that you saw that actually put you on that path. Where did you see that spreadsheet advertisement in New York? Was that in a subway or on the street somewhere, television?
Yeah, I was on the train heading to work, and I saw this ad. I'm sitting on the train, and I looked up like everybody does every day. It's just right there staring me in the face. And I feel like it was just speaking to me. And I was like, that is some very intelligent product placement right there. Because I acted on it immediately, and it really changed my life in a powerful way. And I think this is the power of really good communication to change people's lives and hopefully improve the world for the better.
Yeah, considering how many ads wash over people every day, and especially sitting on the subway where people are heads down or tend to ignore what's around them. In your case, fortunately, you were paying attention and open-minded, and it's amazing the direction that it took your life in.
I hope so. I think so. Yes, I would agree.
So let's start by talking a little bit about what I believe is a core of your work, which is really the science of engagement from the perspective of cognitive science and learning. What I'd like people to understand is, what does engagement mean to you, and what are these core elements that go into making something engaging and being able to engage with people?
So first of all, David, that is such a fabulous question, because I think one of the biggest issues that we have as a society is oftentimes operationalizing a construct and having a shared agreement on what we mean when we say a word. So you just asked, how do I define engagement? And again, a powerful way to begin. For me, I think engagement is sort of a different word for learning. And learning really is a change in behavior. And so the way that I look at it is what drives that change in behavior. And through the lens of learning science, there are sort of different camps that you can sort of look to. So there's a lot of really great research and motivation that looks at what drives engagement and learning. Folks look at things like expectancy theory or goal orientation or values, and how those motivations impact human behavior. We could take many, many days to go through all of these different theories, but essentially, what motivates individuals to make that change in that behavior, and how does that change over time? So that's how I define it. But again, I've seen schools use the same metric for engagement and say, look, everyone's engaged because they're all talking. And then look, everyone's engaged because they're showing up to class. And look, everyone's engaged because they're getting a score. And to me, those are three totally, qualitatively distinct measures that you cannot use the same metric to define. So getting really solid on what it is that you mean about engagement is important, because it looks different for everybody. Somebody can be deeply engaged and concentrating and doing some really great thinking quietly, and you might just think they're daydreaming, but in fact they're really deeply engaged in, for instance, looking at the ad on the subway, whereas you might walk into a meeting where people are really deeply engaged, again is the word, in conversation. And yes, there's great learning there, if we're listening to each other. But if we're all talking at one another, it might seem very active and theatrical, but ultimately, if we are all walking out with the same thoughts that we had walking in, I don't know how much engagement is really happening. So again, a good question, and I think it depends on what your purpose is.
And I read a story online that you told about witnessing someone who you thought was completely disengaged or distracted, and then it turns out that they were far more switched on and engaged than you had ever thought, and that was an interesting lesson learned for you. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I don't know which particular lesson you're talking about, but I have that all the time. I mean, so I have children now of my own, and I've worked with educators and in many classrooms, and oftentimes, again, like I said before, you'll see a student who appears to be daydreaming, and you stop and you say, hey, David, what's going on? And all of a sudden, comes out with the answer to whatever the question was, or an even better answer to the question that you had originally thought. I'm trying to think. The other day, my kid and I were having a really great conversation, and I said, ground control, are you there, Major Tom? And he sort of shouted back and said, well, if humans were really going to take on the body of robots in the future, we'd really have to figure out what it would look like to have more robots if people wanted to have babies. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, I thought he was looking out the window, and here my kid is having this deep conversation with himself about the future of humanity.
How old is he, by the way?
That one is 8.5, has a very active imagination.
Yeah, you're raising some critical thinkers at a young age, whether you're doing it deliberately or whether it's just really solid genetics.
I don't know. Well, that's a very good segue, the genetics question. If you want to talk more about engagement.
Yeah. What are you thinking?
Well, I mean, when you say about genetics, I said earlier that one of one of my biggest drives in the work that I do is how to make education more accessible, and in doing so more equitable for all learners. And one of the things that we think about often is access. And maybe there is a genetic component to it, but there are three sort of overarching themes in developmental psychology, right? And there's this whole idea of nature versus nurture, continuity versus discontinuity, early and late experiences. And what you just suggested, this nature and nurture piece, you're raising him, he's got great genes. Yes. And, we all come to the table with a mixed bag of genes, and it's our experiences that really shape where we go. And so being able to equitably provide really rich experiences for our kids in schools, I think is a key to improving our future and to giving all students an opportunity to find success, not just those whose parents spend an awful lot of time thinking about cognition and instruction.
Right. No, I absolutely agree with you. Kids, and I experienced this with my own kids as well. They have an innate potential, and every kid is different, of course. But the key to having them rise to that full potential is to give them that wealth of rich experiences and not put them in a box, not expose them to one thing, and to really encourage them to think for themselves and to think big. That creativity and play and imagination is what opens up their minds, I think, to all these things that are possible to them, right?
So I would say yes. And how interesting that we have all of this beautiful literature around the power of creativity and the power of, I wouldn't even say creativity, just divergent thinking and role playing and experience, the depth and the richness of how much that enhances our ability to learn and be successful, thoughtful, critical thinkers. And yet we still are functioning, at least in education, on a model of standardization, right? So here we are, it's the spring, and our kids in 3rd through 8th grade across the country are getting ready for these standardized assessments where kids are going to be filling in bubbles. And the 6 hours of them filling in bubbles is then going to somehow represent their summative knowledge acquisition after a whole year of school. So what an interesting dichotomy that we have. Again, this beautiful research that supports the potential, the deep impact of experiential learning, real world applied learning, interdisciplinary in multiple settings across, we talk about multimodal, that it's visual, that it's kinesthetic, that it's auditory. And then we sit kids down in a quiet room for 6 hours and give them a pencil and to fill in bubbles. So I think that that's something really unfortunate, but also it's an opportunity where we can use our platform to make change.
Are you involved in any, or have you been involved in any experimentation or projects or pilot programs where you've attempted other methods or tried to figure out how to start turning the gigantic ship that is the current state of the U.S. education system?
The short answer is yes. And the longer answer is that there are lots of different groups of folks that are going about this work, right? So I think most people can agree that the system of accountability that we currently have, and this is even specific to engagement, this goes back to our first point, is if you're not clear about operationalizing the construct that you're interested in measuring, so what is engagement to you, what is learning to you, then you're not going to do a really good job of measuring that construct. So there are folks that are grassroots activists that I'm part of that are actively choosing for their children not to sit for these tests. There are other organizations that I work with that are working to provide more evidence that experiential learning is more valuable to children and to learners and to their future work. Of course, the company that I created with my 2 co-founders is working to create the experiences that allow kids to take on the roles of an actual scientist and do their job, so that they're going beyond rote regurgitation of content and instead applying it in a meaningful way to demonstrate not only competence, but also to give them that sense of efficacy. So yes, there are a lot of different stakeholders in this conversation. There are lots of folks doing great stuff. And by the way, there are some really great networks of schools. I was just at South by Southwest EDU last week and met with some incredible schools, like Big Picture Learning is doing really cool stuff. Education Reimagined synthesizes a whole host of the schools across the country that are innovating in this work. So there's a lot of different angles to take, and there's a lot of opportunity, and it's exciting. So yes, there's a lot of exciting work out there, and it's great to be a part of these conversations. So I appreciate you asking. Thank you.
Oh yeah, no, of course. Your perspective is it's fascinating, but it's also well-founded in the work that you do. So I think it's great to hear your position and the kinds of work that you're doing around that. A lot of this seems to focus on the notion of obviously different ways to learn, different ways to experience things, different ways to engage. Gaming, and especially gamification, is a hot term right now, especially in our world of research. When we get into consumer research and market research, there's a lot of talk about the need to move away from likening it to a standardized test where you're filling in bubbles, taking a standard survey where you're choosing 1 through 5 or moving a slider between 1 and 10, and instead creating gamification exercises and experiences to get people to give more useful and even reliable feedback. What's been your experience with regards to either learning or really being able to engage and participate when there's some form of game or play or gamification involved?
So I think the first thing, and again, to sort of define the constructs that we're talking about, in the land of education, and then of course in greater society, we talk about gamification, and there's a distinction between gamification and game-based learning that happens. And the way that I map that onto my understanding and my knowledge in psychology is that gamification is sort of, to me, just another way of putting it in the stoplight chart that kids have in the classroom. Are you on green, yellow, or red? And what is that reflecting of your behavior, your engagement, your learning for the day? So to me, that's gamification, whether it's rewarding employees for being on time, or if it's incentivizing folks to purchase a product. That to me is just a level of gamification. Whereas game-based learning is you're learning by doing the game. So by playing or interacting, whether it's a simulation where you're role playing. I'm thinking about the way that oftentimes companies do simulations around human resource, potential issues, and what we do with Killer Snails in terms of simulating the role of a scientist. I believe that the game-based learning itself represents a more deep and impactful, and in fact, the research supports that it's more deep and impactful learning. And I think the way that, from a psychology perspective, gamification to me is very much based on those extrinsic motivators, right? So I'm looking for some sort of extrinsic reward. Whereas game-based learning, if there's a very compelling narrative or if there are some strong game mechanics, can be very intrinsically motivating for the individual. So again, I think defining what it is that you're looking at and what you're looking to accomplish. And then the last bit is that you had mentioned earlier that everyone sort of comes to the table with different experience and a different sort of behavior. And that, again, is the temperament, that we are innately born with a different temperament. Anybody that has more than one child can tell you that, yes, they both came from me, or all 4 or 5 of them came from me, and yet they're all uniquely different. And so what choices individuals make, and even the types of game-based learning they choose, is something powerful to consider, especially when you want to optimize and measure engagement.
Well, and often games and game-based learning and anything related to the terminology of games and play and things like that, people generally think of kids and children. Another thing that I'm curious about, and of course, again, it requires the defining of the construct of engagement, but in this particular context, what have you found, or what are some clear differences between what it takes to engage kids versus adults, and when can the incorporation of either game-based learning or gamification come into play for that?
So the difference between engaging kids and adults, I think it just depends, again, on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So I'm not exactly sure that it's a qualitatively distinct approach depending on how old the individual is. I think it's more about what would you like the result of that engagement to look like. So I'm thinking, for instance, of a game that we play as a family. So one of the games that our company created is called Biome Builder. And we will all sit around the table, our family, playing this game, and we are all deeply engaged in playing the game, and we're all learning different aspects of it as we're playing. And it's similar to, you're trying to stack the cards to create an optimal food chain in a different ecosystem. And so, my older child might be reading the card and really getting an understanding of, taxonomy perhaps, or predator prey relationships. And, my younger one might not be getting the taxonomy, but might also be getting the predator prey. And then, myself and my partner, we're sitting at the table, we're watching, and we're making different observations. So again, I think it depends on what you want that outcome to look like. I do not believe, we had spoken earlier about I had shared earlier a couple of like the big debates in developmental psychology. And one of them is continuity versus discontinuity. And I think that speaks to this comment here. Continuity is more of like the incremental change over time. And discontinuity says that there are stages, like here is an adult. The bucket of adults need this type of experience, whereas these are kids. The bucket of kids need this experience. So I think it depends on what you want the outcome to look like. I think everybody enjoys being playful.
And what it really says to me is that, and this is a misconception that I think a lot of people have, and I probably fall into the trap as well, as you said, of not putting people, groups of people, age groups of people into buckets based on those demographics, but really starting with what is the objective? Because that's really all that matters. And then what's it going to take to achieve that objective based on the groups of people that you need to engage. And that will then drive the most effective ways to do it, rather than starting with, we have to engage this particular group of people to get them to do something. So let's put these people in a box. And then what does that mean we have to do with them?
Well, and I think the best part about what you just said is that you're not just trying to engage people, you're trying to get people to engage with you. And so I think the most powerful thing there is that you're not making an assumption that just because this is, an 8-year-old child or a 65-year-old, grown up or adult, that they are coming to the table with a specific, slate of knowledge or expectations or experiences. You're rather saying, I'd like to give you a voice to tell me where you're coming from and what you think about whatever we're trying to teach you or help you with or support you by providing. And then in understanding that person's voice, creating a more just and equitable approach to educating or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. But again, I spent many years teaching a course in assessment. And yes, you have to know where you're going, right? You have to have a compass so that you can get there, but you have to be flexible to know that there are different pathways.
So most of our listeners work in business or in research in one form or another. And their goal is to drive engagement, however they define it, through some form of content or some form of experience. That engagement could be to get someone to buy a product, or to get someone to vote for a measure or a candidate, or to donate money to a particular nonprofit. So we always start our engagements with understanding what is that end goal, what needs to be accomplished, so that we can work back from that. What would be really helpful to get from you, some tangible takeaways for listeners that they can start applying to their work right away, is once they understand what it is that they're trying to get people to accomplish, are there any universal truths or particular rules of thumb that you think people can apply to their content and experiences in order to engage people in ways that will ultimately drive them to that desired action? And I know that that's all very broad, and please tell me if it's too broad or if there's some way that we can apply some principles around that in general.
Well, so I think that there are a lot of questions embedded within that overarching question. And I think the first piece that you were asking about is about how to tailor the approach to the individual, right? And something that I would love to share from the background of cognitive learning science, my experience in games, and I would love to point folks to even look at, my goodness, there's some beautiful research in very widely read media publications like EdSurge, where you can go and find a whole host of really great pieces on what creates engaging learning experiences. We see that when folks are cooperating during gameplay, there are increases in knowledge gain. So if that's something that you're looking for, you want to increase someone's knowledge and understanding, well, maybe you want to create some sort of cooperative or team building experience, obviously driven by interest and choice. But and we talked earlier about experiential learning, giving folks the opportunity to take on that role, that perspective that you'd like them to enact. And to that end, I would say, oftentimes one of the things that I notice when I get, advertisers ask for my feedback, or they want to, know where I am, or it's like a litmus test of like, who are you and who are you going to vote for? I just want to suggest that self-reported measures are pretty horrible at evaluating authentically where an individual is, either what they care about or what they may actually do, as we maybe have seen in our past election. So self-reported measures are not so great. So creating these experiential learning opportunities, or experiences where folks have to then acting as role playing as another individual make choices, I think that's a better representation of where they are in their thinking and where they're likely to go. That was sort of the first part. But in terms of what is the science for engagement, I would say we can look at a lot of the cognitive research. Well, first and foremost, developing a relationship, right? Always knowing who the people are that you're trying to work with. In our situation, in my case, for instance, it's knowing my students and knowing my teachers and knowing the stakeholders in my community and having a relationship of trust with them so that they know that I'm coming to them, with an open ear and an open heart and working towards a just and more equitable educational experience. For other folks, that your mileage may vary, but something that I take from cognitive science is something like distributed practice, right? So we talk about, if you want someone to remember something, we teach our kids not to cram, right? If you cram the night before, you might remember for the test maybe, but if you take things in small bite-sized pieces, small chunks over time, you're going to remember it for a lot longer. So I like to think about it as a puzzle. And when I talk to my students, to my children, to the teachers that I work with, you think about it as a puzzle, and you put it together slowly over time, and then it becomes this gestalt, this greater whole. There's the idea of interleaving content or experiences, which is, you share information that is complementary but maybe interdisciplinary over time. So you do, a bit of this, for instance, if we're talking about math, and it works really beautifully in experience-based learning and in gamification, because you can give a little bit of multiplication with division, and then a little bit of different theorems that you might be applying in solving a particular problem. And what that's doing is you're interleaving different strategies and different types of knowledge, and not even just in math, but even understanding historical contexts for using that math. And what that does is it engages learners to think about how content is connected and helps them remember it and hold on to it for a longer period of time. The other piece is formative assessment, and always giving feedback to the learners that we work with, to the people that we work with. We want to know what folks know. And for instance, when we play test, when we create our learning experiences, our games, we want to know what the kids are, what they know ahead of time. And of course, we want to know what they know after they've played, but we also want to know what's working and what's not working. And one of the most profound questions that I always am blown away by the responses is when I say to folks, what did I forget to ask you? What is something that you wish I would have asked you that I didn't? And that is oftentimes where you get the most valuable feedback about your product, about your teaching style, about the content that's missing, whatever it may be, because that's where people open up and say, it really would have been helpful if you had fill in the blank.
I think I'm going to be adding that question to my conversations and my interviews as well. I might even turn it back on you here real quick. But I also want to say thank you for unpacking my multi-part question. I am by no means a professional interviewer, and I have some bad habits that I have learned from listening to myself more times than I ever wanted to or thought I'd have to. So asking those multi-part complicated questions that are often hard to parse out is something that I know I need to continue to work on. So thanks for tackling that for me.
No way. I respectfully disagree, David. I respectfully disagree. I think that was a great question. And I think there were so many different ways about answering it. And there's so many components of our shared work that I think are important to discuss. The fact that engagement looks different for everyone, the fact that the goals are different for everyone. I mean, I think each one of these could be, a multi-week course.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not going to do justice at all to a 30-40 minute conversation. There's so much that can be covered here, but I think this is a great tip of the iceberg anyway. I'm curious, do you have any particular stories or results of a study that come to mind where you were really surprised by the outcome? You went into it with maybe a preconceived notion, you expected it to go one way, and then through your work, you were really surprised by the way things actually turned out.
Well, I think that every day I'm surprised by the study. And that's why I love what I do, because we go in, a lot of the work that I've been doing lately with the educators that I've been working with has been around using sort of the lens, the framework of design thinking to rethink what school could be and what it could look like. And so many times I go in with an assumption and I'm proved wrong time and again, which I think is amazing because that's learning, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
changing perspective is learning. But I'm thinking about even in grad school when I went back for my doctorate and my research was around question asking and the types of questions that folks ask depending on what types of content they're learning. And this is something that folks in marketing are probably quite familiar with, that there are different types of questions that people may or may not ask. But as I've gone through the years and worked with educators and students and have done the work and the research, oftentimes, and we know this to be true, you don't know what you don't know. So,
Mm-hmm.
so taking the assumption that people are asking the questions that they think are most important, and that those are all of the questions to be asked, I think was naive. And so over time, I've learned that yes, you don't know what you don't know. Just because you are asking one question doesn't mean that is the best question to ask. I started out with a dissertation question, which is what are the different types of questions that folks ask depending on what they're learning. And there was a huge and there is a huge body of research on what questions people ask. But over time, I've started to think, how do you know when you don't know? And how can we get comfortable with not knowing? And that speaks to this whole push for growth mindset, right? I mean, everybody's heard of grit or mindset. The idea that we are growing and that we don't always know, and that's okay. The problem is when we pretend that we know all the answers, and we don't seek out a way to be better, and by seeking it out, find ways to do better.
So the bottom line is, as a lifelong learner, you're surprised all the time because you're always open to what's really happening and you're not allowing your assumptions or preconceptions to ultimately define your outcomes.
I mean, I would like to agree with that statement, but I don't think that that's true because I have blind spots. And so my hope is that the people around me continue to show me those blind spots so that I can work to get better, because I don't think I think that we're all a work in progress. And I think the ability to provide feedback as well as to receive feedback is powerful. And I think that that's an area where we certainly need a lot more work in education and just in general.
You seem to have a remarkable amount of self-awareness and willingness to really know what your weaknesses and shortcomings may be, as opposed to trying to hide those or overcompensate for those. That takes a lot of courage and like I said, a lot of self-awareness. Is that something that you're even really aware of? And was that something instilled in you early in life? Where do you think all that comes from?
I think that just, we talked about temperament, right? That everyone sort of comes out differently. When I was growing up, and in fact, before I went on to college, I wanted to be in musical theater, and I was very active in the arts. And I always thought it was so important to be as authentic as possible. And it's interesting because now I feel like it's a little bit of being vulnerable. And I find myself, sometimes I'll look back on a conversation and say, gosh, I shouldn't have been so vulnerable in that spot. I shouldn't have presented as so, I don't want to say unsure, because certainly, decades of knowledge and examples and experience, but nobody knows all the things. And what we know today is going to be different tomorrow. And to hold fast to what we know today without being open to what's coming, I think that is the most potentially detrimental part of being a human, right? So again, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that I'm just, as a person, I'm just vulnerable. It's a character trait. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I'm always open to feedback. And trust me, I've had so many failures. There have been more times that things have not worked than that they have worked. I can tell you that having just finished my first book, I had a professor, not in my first graduate program, but in my doctoral program, who said something to me that, my goodness, will stay with me forever. When she looked at me and said, Lindsay, it's a shame that you don't write as well as you speak. And those words, as I'm telling you to them, I hear her saying them in my ears. And hilariously, my editor had no comments on my writing and said, you are the most beautiful writer I've ever seen. And I said to her,
Wow.
in so many years to finally be able to just produce something, because I've been holding on to that and afraid of that. So
Yeah.
I think you have to be vulnerable to grow.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. Really what I'm getting at is that with this show, we try not to only teach the practical, but from people like you that have such an interesting life experience, there are so many things to learn about the way we can interact with others, impact and influence other people by the way we behave, that I just think it's, especially when there's an opportunity to call it out and at least peel back one layer. I just think it's good for people to hear and be able to, shine the mirror on themselves as well and think about that a little bit.
And to not hang your hat on a definition, right? Like, one of my big beefs with psychology, and it's not even psychologists that do it, but for instance, Howard Gardner gave us this beautiful theory of multiple intelligences, but I think it has been misapplied, similar to the misapplication of growth mindset. I don't believe Carol Dweck intended it to be applied in the way that it has been, and yet the theory as it stands is so important. So I think what we're both saying is that continuing to ask the questions and push and say, look, you can't say I'm just an auditory learner, because nobody wants to go to a neurosurgeon that fancies themselves an auditory learner. You're not going to let that person cut open your brain, right? That doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. Understanding the context in which we're using these terms and flexibly adopting them and being open to revise how we think about them, I think is really powerful. And that's, again, that's learning.
Are you able to tell us anything about the book that you just finished?
I am. The title has yet to be determined. However, I've titled it Designed to Learn, Solving Problems with Passion and Purpose. And it's really all about using the process of design thinking, which is understanding by empathizing or taking perspective, which of course we've done today in our conversation, and using that knowledge to help define a problem for that particular individual, that user, I guess, for your audience of marketing folks, for us in education. What is a way that we can help our students see a need by empathizing with others, that we can solve a problem with the knowledge that we have, and then working to identify researching potential reasons or causes for that problem. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is, how do you identify what the root cause is versus a symptom? And hopefully what folks are going to come away with is that if you can remove the root cause, then the problem no longer exists. Whereas if you remove a symptom, it's still there. And how do you see if your idea is going to work? And this is something that's built on all of our work of trying and trying and trying again and iterating. And then ultimately being reflective, which is to be self-regulated in our learning. Where am I? Where do I need to go? What do I need for feedback? And being metacognitive, saying, I know what I know, but there might be blind spots, and how can I fill them in? And who are my allies that I can reach out to call in to help me solve this problem? Because we're not going to solve these problems by ourselves. We'll do it together. So the book is really for educators, although I think that the messages are really for anyone. And in fact, anyone that has a child in a school, or anyone that's interested in the process of how to create more impactful experiences, I think would be interested in this process. And I share vignettes from schools across the country, educators who are doing magnificent work with their kids as early as kindergarten and all the way through higher education. And I think you probably would see a lot of your experiences reflected in it.
Well, that's great. I'm looking forward to it. When are you expecting to publish?
It will be published in October, I believe, through ASCD, which is the Association for Supervision and Curriculum and Development. I can share with you the link later, but yes.
Yeah, please do, and we'll link to Killer Snails as well as the book once it's published, along with this podcast, so people can can
Yeah,
check
we've
that
got
out.
some really cool stuff. We've got some cool virtual reality tools that we're using in schools. We've got some digital games. We have card games. So yeah, it's again, the approach that we take is based on the research, which is that, and I think this goes back to the first thing that we talked about, of the power of the advertisement that made me leave and go into education, is when you match, when you're able to map on multiple modalities, right? Like a powerful visual aid with very succinct language and words, and at the right time and in the right place. That's powerful, and that's how you really start to affect change.
Well, that's a great full circle. I appreciate that. So before I let you go, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, what did I forget to ask you in our conversation today?
Oh boy. I don't know. I feel like we could have had this conversation for quite some time. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share the cognitive science. I'm grateful for the idea that we can all learn from one another. And so something that I wish more folks would ask is, how can we share this interdisciplinary lens of what engagement means to us? Because in education, it means something different, but maybe not really. And how can we work together to better define these constructs, and in doing so, work towards creating better measures, or maybe more authentic ways of measuring them? How can we be more culturally responsive in our classrooms? And how can that culturally responsive pedagogy be applied in our boardrooms? How can we make sure that the engagement is justice driven? I think about, I believe, if I'm saying her name right, Taskim Adams does some beautiful work about global citizenship moving towards justice beyond empathy. There was an EdSurge article that she just published this week that was brilliant. So hopefully together we can start breaking the silos of industry and learn and grow together. I think that would be powerful.
Okay, well, that's great. So we will pass that question along in hopes that it gets asked more often. I can't thank you enough for giving us not only some of your time today, but even more than we had originally planned. And I agree with you. It's never enough in conversations like this. But I learned a lot. I was fascinated, and the best part is I know our listeners are going to have some real, tangible takeaways. So that's a gift from you to us, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me on. I look forward to continuing these conversations and to growing together.